JJ Sussman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Great to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So I want to discuss the fissures, the gaps, the divide within Israeli and Jewish society. And I'd like to speak specifically about the gaps within Jewish society. Obviously, there's an issue with Jews and Arabs in Israel. That's probably material for a different discussion. But today we're going to talk about Jews specifically. JJ, you work for an organization, Gesher, which says on its website, I'm quoting, it trains Israeli leaders to forge connections and unity between different sectors of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora. So as an opening question, perhaps it's the obvious question, we know there are plenty of divisions and we'll talk about them. Why does it matter? Who cares if there are divisions? That's the way the world works.
Yeah, no, look, I think there are definitely divisions, and obviously the world works by divisions, but I think it's a question of how we divide, how we discuss our disagreements, how we interact with one another. At the end of the day, we're really one nation that's not that large. And I think if we've seen throughout our history, the only thing that's really brought us down has been our internal divisions. Whenever there's an external threat, we know how to come together, whether it's Iran today or any other. It's the internal divisions that have, over the course of our history, been the divisions that have really torn us apart and brought us down as a nation. So yes, for sure, we know how to live with disagreements and with divisions. The question is how we can do that while also recognizing we're all still part of one nation and one family.
Okay, then let's talk about what those gaps are. Can you identify the major gaps that you see within Israeli Jewish society?
So what gaps that, we did a poll about a year ago, which asked Israelis what they believe to be the most pressing conflicts within Israeli society. And what came out, we were somewhat surprised. Now, it was at the height of Corona, so maybe it's not that surprising. But the gap in Israel between Chareidi, the ultra-Orthodox, and the rest of Israeli society came out as the one that Israelis pointed to as the most pressing conflict facing us here in Israel. And again, while that's not necessarily surprising, I think what was surprising to us was the extent, the numbers to which Israelis felt that was the most pressing divide. And I think that's something that is eye-opening and one which is within us to really try to heal or try to manage.
Okay, we'll get to that divide in a second. I want to ask, I have lots of questions about that specific divide, including why it was surprising that the numbers were as high as they were. But what other divisions are there in addition to the Chareidi secular divide?
So, of course, you have the Ashkenazim, Sfaradim divide. You have the right against the left. You have Bibi against Rak Lo Bibi, only not Bibi. When politics comes into the equation, obviously there's a lot riding in that as well. So I don't think anyone will be surprised what the divides are. The question is, I think, where we think we can make an impact to manage those divides and what we think we can do about it.
Is Israel diaspora another important divide that you would identify as well?
Yeah, for sure. The Israel diaspora divide is one that we believe to be important. It's not one that in that specific poll came up. It's not, we were asking Israelis within Israeli society. But yeah, and over the last few years, for sure, the divide, and certainly heightened again in Corona when diaspora Jews and nobody essentially was allowed to enter Israeli society. That's one that is getting further and further away from us. And I believe strongly that if we as a society don't put our finger on that and don't recognize that divide, that is one that can cause us also great concern going forward.
Let's mention and discuss that issue of concern, whether it's internal within Israel or the Israel diaspora divide. You mentioned before, when I asked you about why it matters, your answer was we're a single nation, which of course I agree with that. The question is this simply a theological or philosophical problem because we want to be together, or are there practical problems that emerge from our being divided, things that can actually hurt us as a Jewish people, not just on a theoretical plane, but on a practical one as well?
So let's obviously both. I think the Jewish people, is both a religion and a people. And I think first and foremost, the reason to be concerned about it is because we're a people and a family. And I think that we need to recognize that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not that big of a family. And once, I'll share a story actually, if we can, about that. I sat with a leading Jewish philanthropist recently who was talking about how to transfer his values of philanthropy to the next generation. And he mentioned when it was just him, he was the one in the family who made the money. And when it was just him and his wife around the table, it was easy to decide to which charities to support. When it became time for his kids to get involved, he involved all of them, and they sat at his table growing up. So they basically had the same values. It wasn't a challenge. But then they started getting married, and there were 4 children, and each spouse brought a different value into the discussion, and that made it obviously much more exciting. But for him, it was super important to keep everyone around the same table and involve everyone in the discussion. So even if one of them wanted to fund something a little bit different, it was important for him to do it and to support it, to keep the family together. That compounded as you get now to the grandchildren, and you're further and further away from the roots. Yet still, he sees it as prime importance to keep the family together. So even if there's a spouse of a grandchild who wants to support the environment by planting trees in Kenya or whatever the case may be, it is critically important for him to give everyone around the table a voice and to recognize that they are part of that same family. Because otherwise you lose the family, and otherwise you have fights within the family, and that's when things start falling apart. I think the Jewish people is not that different. We need to keep everyone around the table and give everyone a seat at that table. There are going to be disagreements, there are going to be different views, there are going to be somewhat different values, but we need to recognize that we are all one family. We're only 16 million people around the world, plus minus. We're not that big. And if we want to continue as a people, we need to care about those people. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, by the way, who passed away about a year ago, was an honorary patron of Gesher. And he was, he obviously had many, many famous quotes. But one of them he said at a Gesher event, I remember very clearly, was that I don't need you to agree with me, but I need you to care about me. And I think that's an incredibly important message that we as a people oftentimes forget, but need to really take into consideration.
All right, that's obviously a very important point. I want to get to solutions such as what Rabbi Sachs and you were mentioning eventually. First, I want to talk about the divisions. Let's first build up the problem before we get to solutions. Let's talk about that first division you mentioned, the Chareidi secular or Chareidi society in general divide. And I'd like some help in defining this division exactly, because I bet if you asked 10, what?
So would I.
Oh boy, okay. I bet if you ask 10 Israelis to define this divide, you get 10 different answers. I mean, that's probably true for any question you ask 10 Israelis. But in this one in particular, what is defined as the Chareidi or even the religious side? Is this specifically those people who vote for the Chareidi parties like Shas and Gimel? Is it everybody who wears a kippah? Is it everybody who calls themselves Chareidi, including Chareidi Dati Leumi, what's broadly called the Chardal community, maybe associated with Har Hamor Yeshiva, etc.? I don't even know what Chareidi or religious means. And by the same token, I don't know what secular means. Is secular those people who are card-carrying Ben Gurion? We don't believe in the Torah, but we're Israelis, not Jews. Is it somebody who would say that I'm traditional, I light Shabbos candles, I go to shul sometimes? I don't even know what the divide means, because it's a strange divide given that it's so acute and people say it's such a problem. I don't even know who's included on either side of it.
So I think you are highlighting part of the problem, or a major part of the problem. Israelis and people today in general are great at labeling, are great at putting people into buckets. But what can we do when you meet somebody? There's nuance involved. Everyone's made up of many different identities. I don't know. I grew up in America, live in Israel, consider myself religious Zionist. And I like to tell people I send my kids to an incredibly wide plethora of educational institutions. I don't know if this will mean anything to your listeners, but I have a daughter learning in Nishmat. I have a son learning in the Shivani Elon Moreh, as you said, more of a Har Hamor type place, I guess. I don't know, a Kav type place a little bit. I have a son learning in Makor Chaim in the Gush, which is more of an open Orthodox place, not open Orthodox in the
a Gush style place.
Capital O, yeah. And then I have a son learning in high school in Shalvim. And then 2 kids still in elementary school. And I think I'm this incredibly diverse kind of guy. Now, if you go into Tel Aviv and meet a secular person in Tel Aviv and tell them, oh, I'm incredibly diverse, I have kids learning, look at where they're learning. To them, it means nothing, right? You're a religious Zionist guy. I get it. Okay, you are who you are. They think they get it. But I think that's part of the point that, Gesher's been around. We're celebrating our 50th year this year. And it's an organization that was started kind of after the 6-Day War, when there were 2 factions in Israeli society. One, I would say the religious Zionists, the third, believe that we're in the times of the redemption and messianists and all that. Believe a religious fulfillment in the state of Israel. And there were the secular Zionists who believe, that they were responsible for really bringing Zionism to where it is. And Rabbi Dr. Danny Tropper basically saw these paths diverging and felt that if we don't bring them together to at least meet with one another and understand the other side, then we're really going to split into two countries. And I think it's the same thing today. The key is to meet. The key is to bring people together. Once you meet somebody and have a chance to talk to them and discuss their backgrounds, their opinions, their values, you all of a sudden understand that those labels are really just that. They're labels. And everyone is really made up of many, many different identities. And you can still disagree. And we value disagreement. But it's a question of understanding that who's on the other side of that disagreement and what we can do with them. I mean, look at Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right? They were the classic disagreeers. Yet we know what happens there, and that's part of the Jewish people.
Yeah, Beit Hillel 1 and Beit Shammai is all gone. I have a feeling, though, that some groups would like to say, I respect them, but I hope that they'll disappear as well. So there is an element of, sure, I'll talk to you, but I'm right, and I'll tell you what I think, and I'll listen to you, but there's nothing really to discuss. I have a feeling that, especially with the Chareidi secular divide, discussion, I'm not saying it will be futile, but it might not necessarily lead to any bridging, because I don't think a Chareidi Jew living Mea Shearim is going to accept the validity of a secular viewpoint, and vice versa. I don't think a person living in Tel Aviv, living a completely secular life, will say that person living a Hasidic life in Mea Shearim, who won't send his kids to the army, that there's any validity to that whatsoever. I'm not sure what discussion would even do there.
So I don't agree with you at all. I think there are extremists, obviously, on all sides, and you're right. Obviously, even if we're successful, though, the extremists will believe, as you say. But I've seen, and I'm privileged in my work to see again and again and again exactly what you said fall by the wayside. I'll give you two examples. We bring leadership groups of about 15 at a time, made up of Charedim, Chilonim, secular, and Datiyin, in different, let's say 3 of these, 10 of these. But like you said, there's a whole retzef, there's a whole range of people. But whatever, let's call it Chilonim and Charedim for argument's sake. And we have a course where they're together for about 6 months, a few hours each week. And the climax of the course is a 1-week trip to a Jewish community outside of Israel. And there were 2 goals really in doing those trips, or certainly there were in the past. One was to engender a sense of connection to the greater Jewish people amongst the group, and that's why we go to a diaspora Jewish community. And the other is the group itself. The group itself, as you take any group for a long period of time, you recognize they really gel and become like a family, essentially. So one of these trips we went to Los Angeles, and we pair them. We meet with the head of the federation, some rabbis, and some students, and everything else. On Shabbat, we send them out in pairs to people's homes for a Friday night Shabbat dinner. One of the pairs that we sent out was a Chareidi guy, Yitzchak Nachshoni, very senior Chareidi guy in the Chareidi media world. He was editor of one of the major newspapers there. And a Chiloni guy, I won't share his name, it doesn't matter. He's on Channel 2 News, but not Channel 2 anymore, Channel 12 or 13, I always get mixed up which is which, but a very secular senior journalist. And they went out for Friday night dinner. Now, over Shabbat dinner, obviously, they discussed a lot of issues, and the army came up. Now, the secular guy asked Yitzchak, they've been together already now for almost a week overseas, and they've become really close friends. And Yitzchak didn't have a good English. The other guy spent a year in the University of Michigan and had a very good English. So when they asked Yitzchak about the Chareidi position on the army, he asked the other guy if he could translate for him. So he said the Chareidi position, which is, the primacy of Torah, we believe in protecting Am Yisrael, and therefore we don't believe in serving in the army. We're doing our part to protect Am Yisrael. And the other guy had to explain this in English. Now, he came back on Friday night. I basically, in the hotel, accepted all the pairs who came back. And the secular guy came back and essentially was crying. He couldn't believe what words came out of his mouth. He always knew the Chareidi position, and he always disagreed with it, and he still disagrees with it. But for the first time, because the words came out of his mouth from somebody whom he respected sitting right next to him, he understood that guy really believed in what he was saying. And he understood that there's value. I totally disagree with it, but a little bit I get it. I get where he's coming from. I don't know if we can continue, with only 50% of the country serving in the army, but I understand where they're coming from. There was a conversation that came about. I mean, that's just one small example that I see again and again and again. The other quick example, I'm going on and on here, sorry.
No, it's all good.
Involved, the Gesher Film Fund is a foundation that started within Gesher. It's now its own organization. But Shtifel was the show, which obviously many of your listeners probably have seen now, which came out of the Gesher Film Fund. It started in the Gesher Film Fund. I was privileged to be, I think, the first guy to take some of the actors and producers on a tour to some Jewish communities outside of Israel to do kind of like behind the scenes.
So Gesher actually was there before Stissel started and started Stissel Up. Is that what you're saying?
The Gesher Film Fund started Stissel Up. They were there from the very, very beginning. Gesher, where I work today, we took them to the States. We recognized that there was this huge buzz, and we were in the very first week, the very first time that they went on this kind of like behind the scenes after it got popular on Netflix. And they're like, Stissel was a watershed moment, I think, for not just its worldwide popularity, but even for Israeli society. At the time, we had a program, we were helping Chareidim get jobs in society. And part of that effort was to run seminars in businesses to understand who the Chareidim were. Not all Chareidim were similar. Some were, some were Hasidim, some were Litaim, and the like. And one of these meetings, we were meeting with an HR person at a big high-tech company, and she was a kibbutznik herself. And it got to the point where we were telling her about Chareidim, and she said, okay, look, I'm okay if we bring me a Chareidi like Kiva from Stissel. Not like his father, but it got, it goes back to our earlier point, where even within the Chareidi community, there's this retzef. Everyone's different, and everyone, from the outside, everyone looks the same. But once you meet somebody, you recognize that there are all these slight differences and nuances, and the only way you can do that is by meeting and by being, portraying one to the other. And I think those are important points that we need to do more and more of. Corona's made it hard because meeting has become more difficult and more challenging. But I think that makes us only double down on our efforts to facilitate those kinds of meetings between the different people.
It's interesting when you talk about religious diversity almost being in the eye of the beholder. When you talk about your own family, you mentioned at the beginning of your comments that to you are an extraordinarily diverse family. To someone who's not religious, they say, "What do you mean you are? Everyone's exactly the same." When I went to Brandeis University, they used to joke around. There were T-shirts people used to sell of the reasons to go to Brandeis, and every T-shirt had one line. Reason number 7: great religious diversity, Orthodox, conservative, and reform. I think it all depends on your perspective.
Right.
What do you think about getting rid of labels altogether, based on what you just said? Are labels, you said we all put people in boxes. That's the way it works. That's the way our brains work. But would it be a good thing to remove labels, or do labels serve some sort of purpose?
That's a great question that I never really thought of. We started, I told you earlier, we take Israelis outside of Israel, some leaders, not, I don't want people to think that everything we do is flying somebody out of Israel. But we take in groups of 15 leaders as part of our Gesher.
You want a free trip out of Israel? Go to Gesher today, right?
Right. So we take leaders, and when we first started this, people said, it's crazy, it's such an investment. When we recognized right away, so when you take Israelis outside of Israel, all of a sudden all the labels fall and they all become Israelis. If you meet with the head of a Hillel on a campus of Brandeis, they see religious and not religious, but essentially when they're asking, the young American Jews today, the Israeli army doesn't fit their values, all of a sudden it's how do we Israelis answer that question? And the exciting debates then, of course, happen within the group because everyone has a different perspective, but they're all trying to answer it as Israelis, as one of their identities. And most of the labels there, from the eye of the beholder on the other side, fall apart. I think labels are somewhat necessary because you can't meet every single person in the world, so everyone naturally makes their own labels. But in today's world, they've become really dangerous in many ways.
That's a great segue into the Israel diaspora divide. I'll ask about that in one moment. I have one more question to ask about the Chareidi, secular, or whatever we want to call it, divide. Do you know how that animosity, because I think there really is animosity when we look at the negative sense, there is tremendous animosity between these two groups in a general sense. How did that begin? How did it get to this point?
I'm not a historian, but I think if you look back at, we here in Israel are blessed to have the opportunity to defend Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, a privilege that the Jewish people hasn't really had in 2,000 years. And I think when that first started, with Ben Gurion at the beginning of the state, there was the status quo of 400 Talmidei Yeshiva who were allowed to learn. And I think nobody, he didn't have envision that the Chareidi community would grow as large as it did. And when you are a parent and your child is sacrificing his life on the line, you don't think about anything else other than who's not in that same position. That's on one side. On the other side, I think if you believe, religion is the answer to everything, you don't understand anybody on the other side, anybody who's trying to attack the religion. I think also the mixing of church and state, as you will, and now politics, and that everyone's really trying to get a piece of that same pie here is poisonous. Poisonous to the debate, poisonous to religion, and poisonous to many other things. We see that again and again and again when you have representatives on both sides who make statements on behalf of entire swaths of communities. Seemingly, it's hard not to get affected by that. But again, I think once you try to take politics out of that and meet with the other side, it's a whole different story.
In that case, let's move on to the Israel diaspora divide. And personally, I'm very nervous, JJ, about this divide. On practical grounds, Israel does rely on United States support. Even though Jews are a very small percentage of the United States population, Jewish support for Israel has been a reason that both parties have traditionally supported Israel. Obviously, evangelical support at this point is probably much more important simply because it's such a big group. But say within the Democratic Party, at least, I don't want to get into politics, but within the Democratic Party, Jewish support for Israel is one of the reasons, presumably, that many politicians have traditionally felt an affinity for giving money to Israel, to supporting Israel in Congress, etc. Now that it seems, and maybe you'll disagree with me, now that it seems that many Jews in the United States are feeling less of a connection to Israel for whatever reason, I get very nervous about the future on a practical level. There's also a non-practical side that, simply Jews in Israel, Jews in the United States who, I'm speaking specifically about the United States, that's what I know best, but Jews in the United States who don't support Israel as a people, that's simply bothersome on a philosophical level, on a religious level, on a theological level. So let's talk about that right now. Do you think this gap is as bad as I'm portraying it right now, or as dangerous as I'm saying it is right now?
I think the answer to that is I don't know, and we'll see as time goes on. But it's certainly something that's worrisome, certainly for the leaders of Jewish communities outside of Israel and within Israel. I think, like with any gap, and when we see this again in Chareidi secular gap also, there are three ways to try to, deal with it. Three target program, three types of programs, three target types of programs that you can run. One is by bringing the two sides of the coin together in the room and having them meet with one another. One is by working with one side of the equation, and one is by working with the other side of the equation. So in the Chareidi secular community, some other thing, you have programs working with the Charedim, programs working with the non-Charedim, or programs which bring the two together. So in the Israel diaspora thing, I think it's the same thing. You need two to tango here. And I think the diaspora, there's obviously a lot of factors happening in society in general, in America, if we're going to talk about America, and around the world, of polarization and intersectionality and the younger generation's values and on and on and on. That is something which I think for us is somewhat beyond our control to affect. So we can either work with the Jewish community in the diaspora. We're based in Israel. That's somewhat difficult. There are obviously many organizations doing that, Birthright and many others. We can try to bring them together, which is something that we do tangentially a little bit. But I think for us as an Israeli organization, what we really try to do is focus on Israelis. And I think if you go, we talk about if we go to Tel Aviv and talk about my family, if you go to Tel Aviv and ask any guy walking on the street what they know about the diaspora Jewish community outside of Israel, nothing. They don't know it. And that's half of our people live outside of Israel. Again, plus minus. Half the Jewish people today still don't live in Israel. They live outside of Israel. So if we don't know about them, how can we care about them? So I think we have a two-step process here. We in Israel have to first and foremost become aware of the Jewish community outside of Israel. And then once we become aware of them, as a state of the Jewish people, we have to ask ourselves what that means. What are our responsibilities today at 73 years old, when half the Jewish people today now lives in Israel? All of a sudden the shift, there's a paradigm shift happening. And what does that mean to us in Israel to take responsibility, to become the state of the Jewish people? First of all, we have to get to know them. We have to get rid of the ignorance. And then the second stage is, what can we do programmatically to take more a sense of responsibility? Should we be helping them educationally? Should we be not helping them? I think first and foremost, we need to be in conversation with them. We need to be talking to them. We need to understand who they are. And I think that's something we spend a lot of time on. Just in the last year, during Corona, I ran into somebody recently and he said, how was Corona for Gesher? Many organizations really suffered during the pandemic. Many people suffered, obviously. Ironically, we, on both of these issues, both the Chareidi secular divide, which we spoke about earlier, and on the Israel diaspora divide, we started two big programs. One, we're speaking about now Israel diaspora, we partnered with the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs to create something called Am Yisrael, which is an effort together with some major philanthropists, major foundations and philanthropists to do exactly what I said, to work systematically within Israel to create a sense of Jewish peoplehood amongst Israelis as a first step to creating the sense of responsibility towards the greater Jewish people. So you'll see programs together with Masai Israeli or bridging gap year programs with Nichinot, or in the beginning, in just a few weeks, we're going to have something called Shavuot Futsot, a week where a lot of activities will be happening to focus on diaspora Jewry, and each sector in Israeli society in their own way, but to engender a sense of Jewish peoplehood here in Israel, to care about Jews also outside of Israel, I think is critical.
Talking about how Jews in Israel have to care about Jews outside of Israel, obviously that's true. When it goes the other direction, though, one of the reasons I would think that Jews in the diaspora might feel a sense of alienation from Israel, apart from perhaps disagreeing with policies, is also the sense that Israel doesn't care about what they say. In other words, Israel is going to go ahead and make moves regardless of what happens to diaspora Jewry, or regardless of how it affects diaspora Jewry. For example, I know I heard this story many years ago. This is maybe 25 years ago, so I can't vouch for its authenticity, but it makes a point which is certainly true, which is that a group of non-Orthodox Jews, I think they were from the conservative and reform movements, were meeting with a Knesset member from the Labor Party, a more left-wing party. And they were asking for his help in doing whatever it was, whatever changes to the religious status quo. And this Knesset member, as I heard it, certainly sympathized with them. He was himself secular. He had no interest in the religious status quo remaining what it was, but he said, I'm not going to help you. They were surprised. They said, why won't you help us? Don't you agree or identify with our position? He goes, of course, but none of my voters care. Now, if you want to change things, move to Israel. And then if you're a significant voting bloc, then we can talk. But right now, it would be political suicide for me to try and bring your position in Israel, because your position might be very popular in the United States, but in Israel, at least this particular position they were talking about, I don't mean in general the religious status quo, but this particular position, nobody here cares about that, so I can't help you. And on the one hand, one could say that is a very valid position. If you don't live here, why would you have a voice in changing the way the people who do live here have to live their lives? On the other hand, people would say, and this certainly comes up when it comes to things like the Kotel and various other areas, this is the state, as you said, of the Jewish people. It's not the state of the Israeli people. It's the state of the Jewish people. And accordingly, what Israel does should tremendously affect those Jews in America emotionally, and what Israel does should be affected by the feelings and positions and opinions of those people in Chutz La'aretz. What's your feeling about that?
So I think, yes, I think we should be yes on the one hand and no on the other hand. I think, look, Israel is an independent state, like you said, and there are votes, there's a Knesset, and in the end of the day, that's the governing body of the state of Israel. But just recently, there's a whole big discussion about how to potentially give Jews not living in Israel a voice in some of the votes that affect Jews not living outside of Israel. The Kotel was one example you brought up. So around the Kotel issue, it's obviously it's easy to understand why that might affect Jews living outside of Israel as well. That being said, there needs to be some sort of real process that's defined in order to enable that to happen. But I think the conversation itself about how to make that happen, I think is incredibly valuable. We need to not just show that we care, but we need to really care how Jews outside of Israel feel. First and foremost, because we're one family and we're Jewish people. But like you said earlier, there are also practical implications, security implications, long-term viability implications for all of this. And I think if we just shut the door and don't listen, to me, what would be worse if there's that, we get to a point where there's no meeting even between the diaspora Jewish leaders and Israeli Jewish leaders. That would be horrible. The Kotel issue, I think, is doubly challenging for diaspora Jews because there was an agreement in place in 4 or 5 years ago already now, or I don't remember, 4 years ago probably already now, and then the government went back on something which was agreed on, which made it, I think, doubly painful for those who came to that agreement, and that's why I think it's become such a hot button issue. But yes, we should be talking to them. We should be hearing their pain. We should be feeling their pain when they have pain. And I think only in that way can we engender the sense of brotherhood and sisterhood and familyhood and peoplehood, which is so crucial, I think, to live as a nation. Before 73 years, we didn't have a state in Israel, and we were all diaspora Jews, essentially, even those who lived in Israel, for argument's sake. And I think we all have this yearning to have a state of Israel. And now we've got to the point where half the Jewish people live here. Let's not forget about the other half. Let's figure out how to facilitate that conversation and show that we care.
Okay, obviously, JJ, you're talking a lot about conversation. Dialogue seems to be the primary method that Gesher utilizes. Is that right?
Yeah. Meaning,
Okay.
I think our tagline in Hebrew is, I'm going to mess it up now, Lehipagesh, Lahakir, and Lechabed. To meet, to get to know, and to respect. Yeah.
This is my question to you. Obviously, I think that sounds great. The people who join Gesher, I would, if I want to play devil's advocate, I could argue, sure, you can have Chareidi meet with Chilonim, you can have Israel Jews meet with Diaspora Jews, perhaps particularly with the inside Israel divide. Perhaps those people who meet are the people who already have a general sense of, okay, I'm open to the possibility of dialogue. But perhaps someone would argue the vast majority are not interested in dialogue whatsoever. I remember several years ago, it might even be a decade ago at this point, there was a Chareidi rabbi and a Reform rabbi who wrote a book together and went on a speaking tour, which sounds like the kind of thing that you would recommend. They were talking together, outlining their differences and where they agree. And the Chareidi rabbi who co-wrote the book had to drop out because he got so much pressure from his community saying, you can't do this. You can't give legitimization to Reform rabbis. So dialogue is great, but isn't that almost just taking the people who already are open to the concept and allowing them to speak, as opposed to taking the people who really need it, those people who are not open, who won't even entertain the possibility of talking to someone from their perspective as a destroyer of Judaism?
Okay, great question. I think as an organization, like you said, that we focus on this all the time. Certainly, we start with the people who are willing to participate and who can participate. But I think if you go, step by step and slowly but surely, you end up getting deeper into both communities, to people who until now weren't willing to come to such a meeting or weren't willing to entertain the possibility of making change. And we've seen that happen over the last number of years. We started with Charedim, who early on were considered by the Chareidi community outside of their community. But slowly but surely, you get to more quote unquote mainstream people. And mainstream Charedim. I don't know if you saw last week, there was a headline in which the Belz Hasidim announced they're going to start learning English and math and science, I believe, and the like. That's incredibly breakthrough for the Chareidi community. Now, it's Belz Hasidim, it's only elementary school, it's only first to 8th grade, but change happens slowly, and that's on the Chareidi side. But I think on the Chiloni side, it's not just on one side. I think we have to be careful not to just label one side as the challenge. Both sides have their extremists. I think if we can engender both a numbers game and an influence game on both sides as the moderates, as those who are willing to come to the table to talk with one another, they can drown out the extremist voices. And I think that's the challenge. There will always be extremists. Somebody gives the example of a pizza pie, right? In the middle, you have everyone's close to one another, and the further out you go, you have the upper part of the slice and the crust. Those will always be the extremists and the hardest to bring in towards the middle. But if you can have a partnership of the moderates within each side, and I think that's actually 80% of the people in Israeli society. I think the numbers are much higher than we think, and there's a lot of things that we can do practically to get there.
In that case, let me ask, are the divides getting better or worse in your mind? Which is another way of saying, is Gesher, pardon the expression, spitting into the ocean, not really making an effect because you're trying to simply slow down an inevitable slide to greater extremism? Or are people actually coming together? Because sometimes, JJ, it seems from looking at the Knesset that the divides are as deep and as entrenched as always, or as they've ever been. On the other hand, obviously the Knesset is its own separate problem, and perhaps political dialogue and political discourse is a bad way of measuring what's really happening on the ground, because people have to play to their extremes in order to get elected. What do you think?
So like with anything, I think there are always ups and downs. There are always external factors which happen. There are always events that happen which make it worse or make it better. And I think there are always ups and downs. I think we can't afford not to try. I think we can't afford not to do the work that we do. I think a world and an Israeli society without an organization like Gesher would be incredibly worse off for not having the effort put in to try to bridge that divide and to try to bridge that gap. I think I jokingly I say that I have a lot of job security. The Jewish people are always disagreeing with one another, like you said. So I don't know if we'll ever get there 100%, but I think we can't afford not to try. We have another sentence that we use in Hebrew, which sounds better in Hebrew probably, is we try to make Israeli society from a chevra mikutevet to a chevra miguvenet, one which is polarized to one which is diverse. Now there's richness in diversity. Nobody's trying to get rid of the diversity, but I think we need to try to extract from the diversity the positives which everyone brings to the table and go forward in that way.
How can we get past what I've seen? Again, I'll use the Knesset as an example because that's what is said publicly.
A horrible example.
I know, but I can't help myself. The delegitimization that happens so often, that we see people saying, not just that I disagree strongly with you, but you are invalid. You don't deserve a seat at the table. Using one example that's happened recently, there was a Reform rabbi who's been elected to the Knesset, and the religious parties, or at least some of the members of the religious parties, are saying not only that we don't like what you say, but you cannot be in the Knesset. You are basically a destroyer of Judaism. You don't deserve a seat at the table. That's something which is much more difficult when you say someone isn't even legitimate, that not that I disagree with your voice, but that your voice can't even be admitted. And more recently, in the past week, we heard, and this is even within the religious community, and even within the Dati Leumi national religious community, that Rabbi Eliezer Melamed's Sfarim were said to be completely not acceptable by other members of the religious Zionist community, saying not that we disagree with his Piskei Halacha, but we don't accept him as a person. He's unacceptable, almost excommunicated, not literally, but that sort of attitude. What are we supposed to do about something like that?
First of all, I think it's incredibly painful to hear things like that, the tone and the extreme language that's used. And I think, look, take Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, you have a Panini Halacha right there behind you. Is that what you're trying to get?
I guess you see what side of the divide I'm on.
No, but look, even Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, there are 1 million copies of his halachic works already in the homes of people. And yeah, so you can't just dismiss that. You can't just throw that out. Now, it's a challenge. And I think the tone is what bothers me more. People can disagree with him. I think that I'm all for disagreement and all for argument. But I think the tone, like you're highlighting here, I think that's the bigger challenge. How do you deal with the tone? How do you deal with not letting them have a seat at the table? And again, in the case of Melamed, I think he never said anything bad about the other people. He's not hiding his opinions. He wrote books about his opinions.
Well, that's the problem. They don't like.
So
they don't like the opinions he's saying.
As to why his opinions aren't the ones that we should go by, and convince us, from the other side. I think that's a challenge. I heard other rumors about why this is happening now. There's politics involved, and a chief rabbi vote happening in the next year or two, and there are other underlying reasons as to why this is happening now. But I think again, we need to focus on how to lower the flames. Polarization is not just happening here in Israel. And you spoke about the Knesset. Another one of our donors told me a story. He used to be a staffer on Capitol Hill, 30 years ago or more. And he said you were considered a hero if you got a bill passed. He worked for a Democrat Congress or a Republican congressman. But you were considered a hero if you got a bill passed. How did you get a bill passed in those days? You had your views. You had to get the other side to vote along with you to get a majority. So you had to give in on some things. You had to get the other side to give in on some things to make it palatable for them to pass the vote. And then the bill got passed. Today, it's the exact opposite. You're considered a hero if you stand by your morals, your side, your position, and don't budge 1 inch. You're considered the hero. And no bills get passed because everyone's standing entrenched in their own position. But we're stuck. We're stuck as a society. I think you could take that same example to any case here. The social media is partially responsible for it, or whatever the case may be. Intersectionality and other big words that they're talking about. But we need to get past that. We need to create those bridges where different sides can come together and talk about these issues, talk through them, and get past the other side. And we focus on the Jewish people. I think it's critical for us as the Jewish people to learn how to get past all this stuff.
Okay, JJ, it sounds a lot like what you're saying is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, where if each side is extremist, fundamentalist, stays entrenched in its positions, then there can never be a bridge whatsoever. And obviously Gesher, being an organization which means bridge, wants people to somehow meet in the middle. But on some level, and perhaps we'll conclude with this idea, I'll see what you say about it, it sounds to me almost as though you're not saying you really want to bridge the gaps, because let's be realistic, we're never going to really, at least I don't think, really allow or I don't really believe that the Charedim are going to meet in the middle with the Chilonim such that they both come to a middle position which they can both accept. I think that's probably unlikely. I think what you mentioned before, diversity is the key here. Not so much that they agree with each other, not so much that we find a middle ground, a middle road, a bridging of the gaps, as so much as that they simply recognize the legitimacy of the other's position, which will lower the heat tremendously. Once the flame is lowered, it's not that now we're going to have a position that we're going to agree with, and there's going to be one party in Israel because everyone agrees with the same idea. It's more that I still believe very staunchly what I believe and think that you're wrong, but I at least allow you to sit at the table because I recognize that your voice isn't illegitimate fundamentally.
Yeah, I think, it's unity, not uniformity. And a bridge, I think exactly like you said, nobody ends up staying in the middle of the bridge, but they can go back and forth and go back to their side or visit the other side and then come back to their side. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Exactly right. I don't want to get rid of Charedim. I don't want to get rid of Chilonim. I don't want to get rid of religious Zionists. What I do want to do is to create a society which is cohesive, to create chayim mishutafim, to create a joint living space where we can all live our lives and find those bridges when we need to, solve issues together. But yeah, definitely live within our communities. And that adds to the richness of our society, of our people, and of the Jewish people in general. So absolutely.
Okay, well, JJ Sussman, this is very interesting. And I think you're doing very important work. Thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Scott, it's been great being here, and keep up your great work.